And it's live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Morality of Everyday Things. I'm Jake.
And I'm Anne.
And on this podcast, we look at the kind of ethical questions you might ask in your day-to-day life, such as, are you a bad person if you work at Facebook? Or, in today's episode, back on the theme of social media, were Twitter and Facebook wrong to ban President Trump?
So we're saying we're longtime friends, founded a business together called Stasher. Check it out. We met studying a mix of philosophy and economics back at Oxford, longer than I care to admit ago. We aim in this podcast not to tell you what to think. It's more about how to take a structured approach to these sort of questions. How do we break them down? How do you go about getting to an answer that you're happy with, if indeed it exists? We're big fans of nuance, so we'll ask seemingly controversial questions, but really it's about digging into each side.
On today's show, we're trying something new. So we mentioned this at the end of last episode. The show's growth has surpassed our expectation, which is pretty cool. And now we're going to start bringing guests on. So hopefully that will mean we get more expertise on the context of what we're discussing, and it'll introduce you guys and us to fresh perspectives. So on today's show, we've got a couple of guests coming up for you.
Yeah, Jake and I were sick of agreeing with each other. And please genuinely let us know your thoughts. If you preferred the old format, then let us know. And it's all for you guys. Anyway, our first guest is Peter Suciu. He's a tech journalist. His work has appeared in Forbes, Reuters, Fox News, among many others. He's covered social media for a while now, particularly at Forbes, and he recently published an article in Forbes that was titled, "Do social media companies have the right to silence the masses? And is this censoring the government?"
Very on topic. We'll also be joined by Alex Kantrowitz. Alex is the host of Big Technology Podcast. He's a writer who started out at BuzzFeed. He's written a cool book called Always Day One, and it's about the mindset of the big tech titans. And he lives in Silicon Valley, and he's often interviewing them. Those are two separate interviews. We'll cut to both of those now, and then we'll bring it back and give you mine and Anthony's thoughts. Today, we are joined by Peter Suciu. Peter, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself to our audience.
I am an American freelance reporter. I cover social media on a regular basis for Forbes. I also cover military technology for the National Interest.
Nice. Well, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll dive right into this topic. So, as almost all our listeners will be aware, in the last fortnight, President Trump's Twitter account was suspended, and he was also banned from Facebook. And obviously, it's not just Trump who faced bans. There's a lot more that's been going on in this sort of wave of censorship. That might not be the right word. We can get into that. But basically, all this happened in the wake of the events that took place at Capitol Hill on the 6th of January. Peter, could you give our listeners a little bit more context on those events and the bans themselves and what's all going on here?
Absolutely. Well, you use the big C word, censorship, and it's thrown around quite a bit in the United States. I certainly see it on forums. I see it on social media. Anytime anybody's banned, they use the word censorship. They claim it's a First Amendment right. In the United States, the First Amendment actually protects free speech from the government. It allows a free press, free speech from what the public says, that the government cannot censor them. The same does not hold true of private companies. An analogy I use many times is to suggest that if eBay doesn't allow certain things, whether it's pornography, Nazi memorabilia,
Pornographic Nazi memorabilia.
Yes. So if those things are banned on eBay, that is not a First Amendment issue. It's not a censorship issue. It's the same as McDonald's saying no shoes, no service. You have to abide by the rules. So that's something that people have a real hard time getting their head around, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or some of these other things. So really, that's where the censorship, if we're going to use, the air quotes censorship, that's where that comes into play. Where I think we're seeing what's really fascinating about this particular case is this is a case right now where a company had basically sought to silence a government official. And whether you agree, if you're a Trump supporter or a Trump opponent, it still seems to me to be a dangerous precedent that a government official, regardless of what they were saying, was silenced by the media. that sets a situation where the power of the media becomes far greater than what the government would have ever expected. Now, maybe some would say, hey, that's what we want. We want a free and open press. But it's that the press's role has been, and as a reporter, I certainly try to live by this. The press's role is to take an unbiased picture, snapshot, and tell that story to the readers to spread information. Now, I do understand that in the case of former President Trump, many of his supporters, there certainly was a lot of misinformation. And we've seen that has been the dangerous trend with social media, is this spread of misinformation.
I think that there's a few points there that I think are quite interesting that I want to follow up on. That was a great kind of bit of context, by the way. So I think the first question I have around that eBay analogy you gave, what happens when eBay becomes Amazon, and Amazon is your primary way of purchasing, everything in your life? You could argue that pornography and natural memorabilia are we could agree that they're reasonable. What happens when Amazon more arguably arbitrarily starts to decide that people can't use their service? And legally it's no different. It's as long as it's not against the discrimination law, it's their private prerogative. And also they're actually like an essential service, you could argue. In some areas it would be hard to access a lot of goods without a service like Amazon. That's my first question.
Just to summarize that, you're kind of pointing at like when a private company starts imposing its own moral bias on a situation, right?
So I think the example from eBay was, it certainly highlighted the kind of legal framework, but maybe it didn't carry so well because I think most people agree that those are reasonable limitations. And this is an example of where there's disagreement over what the reasonable limitation is.
Fair? Okay.
Well, maybe we could
and then
jump
the second
into
part
that.
is if the platform becomes so essential that it's more of a utility than like a private company I could take or leave.
Okay, actually, that your second question was what was going to be my part of the answer to the first, and that is, when does a service become akin to a utility? Certainly in the United States, the utilities, the electric companies, they started out very much as you described. They were the Amazon of the time. If you wanted electrical power, there were in some cities competing services that provided this. So I think what we've seen is, when I bring up the analogy of the eBay being like McDonald's, we're certainly seeing that right now Amazon is reaching the point of utility. Will they need to fall into some regulations so that they're not just selling Big Macs? And I'm mixing metaphors here and mixing companies, and I understand that. I guess the question then becomes, would an eBay become that competitor to Amazon, and are rules needed to be put in place that you can't just sell one line of laundry detergent? I think that's where the concern becomes, is that Amazon now starts making these deals with companies. Okay, we're only going to sell Tide, and we're only going to sell Pepsi Cola, and Coke, you're out of you can't get it here. That would be the concern. But to be honest, I don't know if that would ever happen, because in a free market society, especially in the United States and Western Europe and other places around the world, consumers really like the choice. So I think as long as consumers want the choice, Amazon is going to sell those products. Now, we have seen that Amazon has pulled the QAnon conspiracy theory products, but you could still go on Amazon today and buy an Impeach Biden t-shirt and just as easily as you could have bought 2 weeks ago an Impeach Trump t-shirt. So I think we're still seeing that stuff available.
Yeah. Just a quick point on Amazon. I think another thing that's interesting, and obviously they also control AWS, right? And one of the big things they did in the wake of Trump being banned and suspended was they basically shut down the servers of Parler, didn't they?
Correct. Which is, I guess by analogy, it's the equivalent of just like shutting off the electricity to, your competitor's factory or
Exactly.
someone you don't like, or someone you don't agree with factory.
And this is where the line between service and utility definitely blurs, because access to the internet is more and more of a like essential utility in this day and age. And that's where I think in the case of social media, it also gets really interesting, because I guess what you're kind of pointing at there, Peter, was certainly something like Facebook has massive influence on the news and information that people consume, right? That's an area where it does start to get really interesting and the lines start to blur.
I have a question from Peter's first initial context, and it kind of leads us to the next question. So I'll start with the next question, which is why now? Why the events of the 6th of January? Like why has all of this happened, at this moment in time? And I actually, while thinking about your first response, kind of had an initial question that might go some way to answer this, and I want to get your view on it. So you mentioned that one of the major concerns is that these are platforms silencing government, in a sense, right? But that immediately made me think, can the reason that this has happened now be something to do with the fact that, de facto, Trump no longer really was government? Obviously, he was still technically president, but at the point where you've lost the election and we're basically filling time between now and the inauguration at that point, there can kind of be a view that, it's practically ceremonial. You can still do stuff, and obviously it tends to be a time when people sign a lot of executive orders and pardons and things like that. But as far as everyone's concerned, you're no longer, de facto the president, if you know what I mean.
We have a term for that, lame duck.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. The misinformation that spread, the fact that President Trump refused to concede is certainly a black mark on American democracy. And he certainly riled up the movement. Back to the social media aspect, I've written about this. One of the things I called out was how many liberal activists, Alyssa Milano being key among them, took to social media after the election and said, I'm willing to reach out my olive branch to the other side. And again, I find that extremely insulting, extremely disingenuous, regardless of which side you're on, because if things had gone the other way, I very much doubt she would have said, okay, my guy lost. Here's an olive branch. I'm willing to see what you can do. She would have happily remained part of the resistance. I had called before the election and had kind of reached out to my liberal friends as well as my conservative friends with the argument we're all Americans. And what I found to be shocking just weeks before the election was one group says, no, we'll never support fascism. And the other group says, no, we'll never support socialism. So as a centralist, I'm seeing that both sides have no willingness to work with the other side. And this is all just being intensified on social media. And I think where some of the anger we're seeing now is that Amazon's web services did shut down Parler, which, by the way, was actually meant to be pronounced parlay, but Americans pronounce things as they're spelled. So we really couldn't get around the parlay.
I didn't realize it was intended to be French.
Yes.
Interesting. Do you think Ant's right then? Do you think there is an argument that there's no way they would have chosen to silence Trump ahead of the election? I suppose that would have caused complete outrage, but it got to this point in time. There's such little time left in his presidency, and he's sort of crossed a line, right? I think you see even people on both sides of the spectrum saying the events of the Capitol were shameful, and incitement to violence seems to be a fairly obvious or easy line to draw if you are going to set a moral marker. It is crazy. They would have had so many opportunities before now to limit, ban, or silence some of the stuff that he said and the misinformation that he spread. But I suppose they've kind of left it to this point where there's less for them to lose.
I mean, we're a podcast that touches many things, but focuses heavily on moral perspectives. So I think it would be interesting just to kind of ask the outright question: do you think that social media in this context was doing the right thing?
Yes, I think that Trump absolutely crossed the line. The spreading of misinformation, the arguing that the election was stolen when the evidence wasn't there, certainly crossed the line. There is absolutely no doubt about it. I think, if anything, I really believe we need more filters on our elected officials. when it comes to social media. I think one of the problems we've had is that it's such a new platform relatively. I mean, yeah, there's those of us that have used Facebook or Twitter since day one, but it really was after 2016, after the election, and then 2017 when he took the office, that the president just kept tweeting. And I mean, I know many supporters of the president even said, you got to stop tweeting. And it was hoped he would stop tweeting. I mean, South Park made a whole episode about the caricature version of Trump just taking to social media. And the whole point of the show was, we just wish he would tweet less. The truth of the matter is that politicians, we're used to seeing them come out and seem polished, and maybe they're not always as articulate. Certainly George W. Bush and Joe Biden are not the orators of the ages that a Barack Obama was, but these were prepared, they were crafted, they were refined. And you can even see when Trump would speak, even at the last State of the Union, when he was reading, he was articulate, he seemed presidential. When he went off script, he sounded like Donald Trump. And I think the problem with social media with Donald Trump, and I'm worried about future politicians, and I mean, maybe there's people that want their politicians to sound real, and certainly that was the appeal of a Donald Trump to a large part of his base. With social media, it's all too easy to have a very one-sided conversation and believe that you're articulate, that you're polished, that you're funny when you need to be, that you're serious when you need to be, and that you're making your point. And I think that's a problem with social media, is that people, there's no filter. There's no filter, and people say what they're going to say and just keep talking. And that's a problem.
I have a question on that front, actually, particularly relevant since you're a journalist. You're correct. Social media is new, but the spread of information isn't new, and the spread of disinformation for political gain isn't new. I think the famous example that people always give is the campaigning between Adams and Jefferson. Basically, they just were writing a bunch of slander about each other via newspapers, which ultimately had some pretty negative effects on their partners and on their following, and overall on disunity. How do you think media has kind of navigated that territory, and how do you think that those learnings could be applied to social media?
Well, I think that's one of the problems too. One of the stories I've written for Forbes was that nearly 3/4 of Americans get some of their news from social media. As a reporter, as a journalist, as somebody who takes credibility, journalistic ethics very seriously, I find that to be very concerning. When I do articles, a lot of times, I'm talking to sources, I'm vetting what they're saying. If I talk to a source and he says NASA has a base on the moon, I don't run with it like our grocery store tabloids, NASA's on the moon working with aliens. That has to be vetted, that has to be checked, that has to be confirmed. And the problem with social media is that it has allowed many people just to repeatedly share what they read. Just because you heard it from somebody doesn't make it factually true. And I think the flip side of the coin is, as everybody's trying to get more eyeballs, we see many reporters trying to be relevant on social media.
The difference is that social media is sort of open to anyone. Like, content can come from anyone, anywhere. There's nobody who's being held to account in the same way that journalists are, right? So
the way that good journalism spreads is via maintaining and building a good reputation
and integrity
for high integrity, reliable journalism, whereas social media disproportionately benefits shock value.
So it is actually quite tricky to map what worked for sort of regulating media into what worked for regulating social media. Can I interject with a cynical hypothesis? I think
I thought you asked, and then you've just gone ahead and done it, mate.
Yeah. Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that their decision to ban Trump potentially comes from the fact that they're trying to court favor with the left after the Senate vote went the way that it did. So The timing is completely aligned, right? Obviously that happened and then everything at the Capitol happened, and it all happened in quite a short space of time. And Facebook in particular, Zuckerberg's done a lot to court favor with Republicans, Trump and everything in the last few years. I do wonder cynically if it's possible that that's actually what's guided their decision.
I will add that I think, and as a matter of disclosure, full disclosure, I did work on staff at Fox News in the late 90s, and I still am an occasional contributor to foxnews.com. So I do want that out there as a full disclosure. Over the years, I've also contributed to MSNBC. I've appeared on CNN. So I try to be as unbiased as possible. But the cynical part of me also has to jump in and interject and say, remember that it was the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warrens and others that have called for a breakup of Facebook and has questioned whether Amazon has gotten too big and whether Google is certainly too big. So I do have to wonder if the tech sector wasn't being anti-Trump to get some favor back from the left, like, hey, Senator Warren, look, we silenced the guy. Are you sure you want to break us up? And again, that's my cynical take on it. I'm not saying this necessarily as a reporter. I'm saying this as cynical Peter about this.
So to take it to the question I asked a couple questions ago, then from what you've said, is it fair to say that then you think that in this specific context, it was the right thing to do? And it sounded like your main premise was not on some basis of principles or fundamental rights. It was more on practicality. Trump had crossed the line and the risk of danger was too significantly high.
At this point, Trump needed to be silenced. I do think he incited a serious protest. Did he actually incite violence? I don't know if I could make that argument. He certainly crossed the line in getting the crowd going.
Yeah.
Though I have to say, I'm one of those people that's cynical too, that wonders what the intent was in advance. Would this have happened anyway? I mean, when we're seeing that there were pipe bombs, that these people were armed, that they had the hand zip ties for handcuff, those
aren't responses to his talk at whatever time on Wednesday, right?
No, there definitely was some planning there.
Peter, did you have any closing thoughts or anything you wanted to share?
Only thing I can say is that I think if we're going to see any unity in the United States, that perhaps the rhetoric from both sides needs to be toned down, not just from our leaders, but the comments on social media. I think if you really want to heal in the United States and bring back some unity, we can't just constantly tweet out our opinions. It used to be said that in polite company, you didn't talk about politics, you didn't talk about religion. People don't talk much about religion on social media, but politics dominates right now. And maybe, Twitter and Facebook and others, they don't have to ban it, but maybe if they had a campaign, be nice, let's not share politics on social media. Maybe if we were can we try a week of not complaining about politicians or pushing our agenda on social media? Maybe if we just did something like that, we could come back to unity.
I wonder if that's something we could ever get going. But no, I think that's completely true. Perhaps banning as a measure is too strong a way to go, but certainly some steps need to be taken to tone down the content of conversation around it. There's a whole another line we could go down around why social media business models contradict that, but that's for a different thing. Peter, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you.
Yeah, all great to catch up. Cheers, mate.
We're joined today by Alex Kantrowitz. Alex, be great if you could just give our audience a quick introduction about yourself, and then we'll ask you the headline question.
Yeah, hey everyone. I run a publication called Big Technology. It's dedicated to covering Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, a few companies you may have heard of, with honest and non-ideological perspective. And if you like podcasts, I also run the Big Technology Podcast. It's just Big Technology Podcast on your podcast app of choice. We have an interview with a insider or outside agitator every Wednesday.
Oh, that's cool. I need to check that out. I haven't listened to it yet.
Oh, it's good, man. Yeah, it's good. So Alex,
listen to Jacob. He knows what he's talking about.
all of you listen to Jacob.
So, Alex, let's kick things off with the big question. Facebook and Twitter banned Trump, ex-President Trump, in the last fortnight. Was that the right move?
Yeah, I mean, it's a decision that is a tough one to make. I certainly understand it. It's tough to get into right or wrong. I mean, I guess, given the situation the United States was in last week, it would be hard to justify keeping him on the platform. I mean, he just used Twitter and his speech to send a bunch of people to the Capitol